Imagine you wake up at 4 in the morning. Your alarm went off because you're supposed to eat before sunrise. It's the first day of the holiest month of your year, the one your whole family has been preparing for weeks. You walk to the bathroom, and you realize you've gotten your period. So now what? Today, what actually happens to Muslim women during Ramadan when their body decides this isn't going to be their month? There's one verse in the Quran that touches this subject. The way it opens is not what you'd expect. There's a moment during the cycle that a lot of women describe as the worst spiritual loss of their entire year. And there's something the Prophet himself once did, 1400 years ago, that was kind of radical for his time. Quick context, in case Ramadan isn't really on your radar. It's the 9th month of the Islamic calendar. For 30 days in a row, Muslims fast from sunrise to sunset. No food, no water, not even gum. At sunset, the fast breaks with a family meal called iftar. But fasting is only one part of it. People pray more. They read the Quran more. They give more to people who need it. A lot of women describe Ramadan as the most meaningful month of their year. They also describe it as the most physically exhausting one their body goes through. Now the rule. It's been in place since the very beginning of Islam. Women on their period don't fast during Ramadan. They also skip the 5 daily prayers. They don't enter the prayer area of the mosque. And by older legal scholarship, they don't even touch the physical Quran. The fasts they miss get made up later in the year, day for day. The prayers don't. Those just get skipped with no makeup required. This isn't one of those rules that changes between countries or sects. Here's the part most outsiders never actually see. In countries where everyone's fasting together, eating in public during the day just isn't done. In some places, you can be fined for it. So even if a woman is on her period and she's technically allowed to eat, she can't really do it in front of anyone. She does it in private, behind a closed door, often without telling a single person why. For some women, that's quiet relief. For others, it's a small recurring moment of shame. That gap between what religion permits and what the culture around her expects is where this whole story actually starts. Which raises the obvious question. If the rule pauses a woman's religious life for a week every month, does Islam see menstruation as something shameful? The answer, if you go back to the original source, is more surprising than you'd expect. In the entire Quran, there's exactly one verse that addresses menstruation. It opens with the words, "They ask you concerning menstruation." From the history around the verse, we know who they was. It was the women in the early Muslim community in Medina. They went to the Prophet themselves, asked him about their bodies, and the verse came back as a response to their question. What the verse actually says is short. It tells men to keep apart from their wives sexually during her period. That's it. Nothing about fasting, nothing about prayer. No language calling her impure in any larger sense. So if the Quran doesn't lay out the bigger rules, where do they come from? They come from hadith, which are the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet. The most cited source is a hadith from one of the Prophet's wives. She described how women in the earliest community didn't fast or pray on their period, made up the fast later, and never made up the prayer. So the rule itself isn't really in the Quran. It comes from how the early community lived, and how scholars later wrote that down as law. There's also a much more controversial hadith. In it, the Prophet describes women as deficient in religion, and he clarifies what he means. The days during her period when she's exempt from prayer. That one phrase has done a lot of damage over the centuries. For a long time, it got pulled out of context to suggest women are just less spiritually serious than men. Modern Muslim scholars have spent enormous energy untangling it, and most of the ones doing that work are women themselves. Their argument is that the word translated as deficient is a specific legal term. It means has fewer required duties on those days, which is basically saying you've been given a break, not you're worth less. So why is the rule there at all? There are two interpretations that have been around for centuries. The first is mercy. Periods are physically hard. Cramps, fatigue, blood loss, the whole thing your body is doing. The argument goes, God knows that, and isn't going to ask a woman to layer a 30-day fast on top of an already heavy week. From this angle, the exemption is grace, a built-in rest. The second is ritual purity. In classical Islamic law, Menstruation puts a woman in a state called major impurity. That state pauses certain ritual acts: prayer, fasting, touching the Quran, entering the prayer area of the mosque. And it's worth saying clearly, this is not supposed to mean her body is dirty. It's a category in religious law about ritual status, not a moral judgment. Which brings us to the part that doesn't show up in any scholarship. How do the women themselves live with it? A few answers come up over and over. The first one is some version of shame. Mostly in countries where everyone around her is fasting together, women describe sneaking food into their own bedrooms, hiding the wrappers at the bottom of the bin, brushing their teeth before opening the door so nobody can smell what they just ate. Sometimes the men in the house don't know. Sometimes the kids don't know either. The second answer women describe is relief. These are the women who say, God knows what's happening in my body. He built this exemption in on purpose. That week off feels like permission to slow down at the most demanding spiritual time of the year. A lot of these women describe their period during Ramadan as the only stretch in the entire month when they really get to rest. They might still cook iftar in the evening. They just don't pray with the family afterward. They watch the sun go down without having to break a fast first. A half step out of the intensity while everyone around them is at full speed. And then there's the answer that actually makes a lot of women cry. It's what happens when their period falls on the night of power, Laylat al-Qadr. It's one of the holiest nights of the entire Islamic year. It falls somewhere in the last 10 days of Ramadan, on an odd-numbered night. And some Muslims believe a single act of worship that night counts more than 1,000 months of regular prayer. So women plan their year around it. They pray for it. They hope they'll be present for it. If your period falls on that exact night, you can't pray, you can't fast, and it's gone for that year. But some women have started turning that grief into something else. They sit on a prayer mat without praying formally. They quietly remember God in their own way, which is allowed during their period. They read translations of the Quran on a phone, because most scholars agree screens don't count the same as a physical copy. So instead of just skipping the night, they're remaking what the night can mean for them. Something else is changing right now, and it's mostly happening online. Women are finally talking about all of this out loud. There are whole communities on TikTok, on Substack, in Muslim women's blogs, where the rules and the shame and the quiet workarounds are getting shared in public for the first time. So, back to the woman you imagined at the start. She's just woken up. First morning of Ramadan, she's on her period. What happens next depends a lot on which version of the story she grew up with. If she only ever heard the purity version, she might feel quietly shut out of her own community for a week. If she grew up with the mercy version, she might lie back on the couch and feel looked after. Most women say they live somewhere in between, and the way it feels shifts a lot as they get older. I'll leave you with the thing I really didn't expect to find when I was researching this. 1400 years ago, the women of Medina were openly asking the Prophet questions about their periods, in public, with men in the room. The verse in the Quran literally starts with the words, "They ask you," meaning the women asked first. The answer came back to them. And there's a hadith that gets almost no airtime. The Prophet would drink from the same cup as his wife while she was on her period. He'd eat from the same plate. In the surrounding culture at the time, menstruating women were treated as basically untouchable, sometimes made to sleep separately. So for that moment in history, sharing a cup was, for the time, kind of radical. The source material is actually more open than what got built around it later. The women in this story were never silent. The conversation just changed shape over the centuries. And right now, it's changing again. If you want more questions like this, the kind that don't usually get asked from a Western point of view, this is the channel for it.